Right. Thank you so much for coming in so early and for including us in the program. This is joint work with Silvia Farina at Berkeley University and Marco Tabellini at the Harvard Business School. And in this paper, we want to try to better understand the relationship between World War II and the roots of the civil rights movement. And as you all know, the civil rights movement was one of the most important social and grassroots movements in the 20th century, which took all forms of protest. So you would see bus boycotts, sit-ins, the famous freedom rides, protests, and marches. And this is, hang on, I can actually take this off, right? Okay. And this movement also spawned a whole lot of the very famous leaders such as Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, or Rosa Parks that you all know. And this struggle, this movement, ultimately is very successful in terms of the policies that it achieves, right? So it culminates into very important Supreme Court decisions, such as Brown versus Board, or different kinds of legislations, such as the different Civil Rights Acts, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, among others. And economists have studied these different acts, policy changes, and Supreme Court decisions at quite some detail. So here is a very non-exhaustive list of some examples of papers that have studied the impacts of these decisions and these legislatory changes, where people have looked at the impact on voter turnout and state spending on African Americans, the effect on wages and employment, which was a big one in particular with respect to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, political attitudes, school segregation, and so on. And so in this paper, we would like to take this one step back a little further. And instead of studying the outcomes or the effects of these different legislations, we want to study more the movement or the origins of the movement that led to these legislatory changes. And there's different kinds of theories as to where the roots of the civil rights movement lie in. So one of them is the organizational drivers, such as the NAACP, which was very active even before World War II in pushing changes in the courtrooms, but was a very more elite type of organization. So it was not necessarily like a grassroots movement, but definitely influential. Then, of course, Black churches also played an important role in facilitating the movement. For example, important civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King or Oliver Brown, the lead plaintiff in Brown versus Board, they were ministers, for example. But the one factor that we want to study in this paper is service in World War II. Right, so the idea is formulated by political scientists such as Parker in 2009. And this is something that Black leaders during World War II pushed a lot for, which is participation in the war. And so the idea is that we pay with blood for this society, and in return, we want more rights and better treatment. Right, so that's the idea. So the idea that you can formulate this social contract where you exchange a visible contribution to the societal goal of winning the war for better treatment. And this is, for example, also something that you see on a broader scale in the media, for example, in the Double B campaign that started in the Pittsburgh Courier, where one soldier described the struggle against the Nazis abroad and then against Jim Crow at home. So that was the Double B, the two victories that needed to be achieved. And recent work by historians such as Guillermo attribute quite a lot of the earliest civil rights movement straight after World War II to this service component. So Guillermo writes that Black servicemen and some women were the central actors, planners, organizers, and mobilizers in the struggle. And that's the idea that we want to test in this paper. So we want to see how did Black veterans affect political mobilization in the civil rights movement after the war. And for this, we have different kinds of data from the CORE, as well as some data from newspapers on protests and boycotts. So this is the political mobilization part. And then we want to see whether this actually translates into changes in political outcomes, such as presidential election vote shares, where we in particular look at the vote share for Strom or against Strom-Thurmond in 1948, which in the literature is a common proxy for pro-segregationist tendencies. We also, and this is for future work, because this is, should have said this in the beginning, all work in progress. So all of your comments will be very much appreciated. What we plan to do in the future is also to see whether areas or congressional districts with more Black veterans saw changes in the kinds of attitudes of the elected Congress members. For this, we use the Bateman scores, for example. And so this is all very much related to John's paper with his co-authors, where they look at voter registration in 1965 and the relationship with Black World War II veterans. And one thing that also happens at the same time that we're going to show you, so there's a positive effect of these Black veterans on all of these political outcomes. But what we also find is that there's a kind of backlash coming from areas with more white veterans. And this is something that we also want to shed some more light on. Now, it's difficult to get identification for like draft rates or white draft rates in this case. So what we're trying to do is to extract some exogenous variation that come from the monthly call rates by race that were imposed by the federal government, together with the pre-war distribution of Blacks and whites in each county or congressional district, which we control for later. And so hopefully this will give us a reasonable instrument for the actual share of Black veterans. And what we then ultimately also want to do is to run a horse race between the share of Black veterans in this relationship with the civil rights movement. So between the Black veterans, as well as other things that are happening at the same time. Because in this period of time, you see a lot of different changes. So you have the Great Migration, you have large-scale occupational upgrading of African Americans. And then we want to see how do these different factors compare to the Black draft rates, and which of these is relatively more influential in predicting the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. So just to give you an example, and so this is, no, I would not try to move this because this will gonna go bad. So this is Oliver Brown with his daughter, Linda. And like I said, he was a minister, but he was also a World War II veteran. And he is the Brown in Brown versus board. And he wanted to push for school desegregation exactly to provide his daughter with a better future. And because he fought in the war and he said, hey, my kid is supposed to have a better future. And there's other examples of influential civil rights leaders later on that were veterans of World War II. So these are the kinds of people who we're interested in and who we think are driving the organization and this overall movement. Now, to give you an idea in terms of the expectations of Black and white soldiers, we found these attitude surveys that the Army conducted during the war. And they asked soldiers all sorts of different kinds of questions. And this is for Black soldiers only, where we split the sample into South and non-South. What I want to highlight is that overall, Blacks had a relatively more positive view of how the newspapers reported on their contribution in the war in the South, actually. And as you can also see in these two rows here, is that there's a clear expectation that after the war, Blacks will be treated better, right? So it's this expectation that they fight in the war, and in exchange, there's going to be some sort of reward, and that reward is better treatment and more rights. Now, let me show you how white soldiers feel about this. So that's in particular this row here and the next one, so which says blacks will have more rights after the war. And about less than a third of white soldiers agreed with this. There's no difference really between the South and the non-South. But when you look at the next question, blacks should have more rights after the war. That number is relatively smaller in the South compared to outside the South, but still pretty small overall. So this is already foreshadowing some of the results that we see. So there's going to be a positive effect on civil rights related outcomes coming from black veterans and a negative effect from white veterans. But these are the kind of regressions that we're interested in running. So where we regress a given civil rights outcome in area A on area fixed effect. So this could be a county or a metropolitan statistical area or congressional district later. And we regress this on the share of black veterans in that particular area. And then we include controls for different demographic, labor market, geographical, and political characteristics. And now, of course, we don't think that the black draft rate is randomly distributed across space. So we have a monthly panel of draft and call rates by race. And so what we do is we regress the number of drafted men in state S, county C, and month M on the interaction between the number of black men who were called, so the draft quota that was imposed, times the number of men of service eligible, black men of service eligible age in 1940. And then we use this prediction to generate a predicted draft rate that is going to serve as the instrument for the actual draft rate. And this is very similar to the exercise in Darlin-Lochner in their 2012 AER paper, where they used changes in the EATC schedule to predict household income. So this is what the first stage is looking like. So we regress the actual black draft rate on the predicted black draft rate from the previous slide. And this is probably not too strong at the moment, but there's a lot of noise in this data. John also knows this because he works with this data, but we're trying to clean this up a little bit more and get this a bit stronger. And now let me show you some results regarding civil rights movement related outcomes. So here is different dummy variables at the MSA level, where we regressed a dummy for whether you see a black protest in your MSA on the black draft rate. And you see that as a positive and significant effect. These protests also tend to be more peaceful. They tend to be more often boycotts rather than riots, and they tend to be larger in scale. And also in the IV, we pretty much find the same results, a bit more noisily estimated, which is normal, but it goes in the same direction. Now, for the political outcomes, so the next question is, does this increased political participation in the movement also lead to changes in actual political outcomes? And here we have the Strom-Thurmond vote share in 1948 that we regressed on both the black and the white draft rates. When we do the IV, at the moment, we only have the IV for the black draft rate. But this is what I was saying earlier on. We see this negative effect on the Strom-Thurmond vote share coming from black veterans, whereas for white veterans, this goes in the opposite direction. So it's the kind of backlash effect that I was referring to earlier. And let me just briefly pitch what we want to do in the next steps for this paper before I wrap up. So the next thing we want to do is we want to look at how Congress members vote on different civil rights related bills. We also want to see how their attitudes towards these kinds of legislation changes using the Bateman and DW nominate scores. And like I said, at the end, we also want to run this horse race between the black draft rate and all of these other important factors that had influential impact on the standing, political and social and economic standing of Blacks in the South. So, like I said, all of this is still very preliminary. Love to hear your thoughts on this project. And otherwise, I'll just leave the floor to John. Thank you.
All right. So it's a pleasure to get to discuss Andy's paper. As you mentioned, I have a lot of overlapping interests here, and it's still very much a work in progress, and so I'm going to be offering sort of big picture, likely impossible things to do, but perhaps a kernel of something in there will be helpful. So the big idea behind this paper, right, is that the service in World War II produced a class of Black GIs who were then integral to the civil rights movement. Right, so one of the prime examples of this being Medgar Evers, right? So here you can see him in uniform in the military and then protesting, being a leader in the civil rights movement. But to sort of motivate some of my discussion here, I want to switch to a different example, also fairly famous. So here we have Jackie Robinson in uniform and Jackie Robinson in uniform as well. And so he served in World War II and then broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball shortly thereafter. Right. And I think Jackie Robinson provides this interesting example of the tension that their paper is going to have to deal with of what is it about service that leads to this effective civil rights movement. And so one way you could think about this is that idea of the sacrifice in World War II is going to make society more amenable to providing you additional rights thereafter. And so Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier, being allowed to play Major League Baseball. But that very same Jackie Robinson, it was also court-martialed while in World War II for refusing to move in the military bus he was in. And he was not convicted, he was found not guilty, but there's the court-martial. And so this was an act of protest, essentially, while in service. And so that's a very different way that these Black GIs are going to be involved in the civil rights movement, right? Potentially as a response to negative experiences during the war, right? And so that, to me, is going to be really one of the central things to grapple with as they work through the results and try to interpret these results. So why does service matter here? Okay, so there's several possibilities on the service side, but I think there's potentially different ways to explore, right? So one is just being exposed to different societies. And so you hear anecdotal stories about Black GIs staying in Europe afterward, right? And so just being exposed to something other than that county that you grew up in, right, changes the way you think about your position in the world and what's possible. Okay? I think probably a bigger part of the story here, though, is the segregation and discrimination faced during World War II within the military, despite making this huge sacrifice, right? And so that could motivate additional interest in participating in the civil rights movement, coming back from the war. And then finally, I think a really interesting channel to think about is the extent to which leadership skills developed in military service translate into leadership skills in the civil rights movement, right? So that's another potential channel that might be at play. So there's also different possibilities on the domestic front here. So it could be that because you made that sacrifice, you gain additional political voice here in the States, both within the Black community and also sort of relative to the white community. There's also the potential that your fellow white veterans may be an ally in that civil rights movement, but as I think some of the results are starting to show they have, right, potentially also kind of a hindrance to that movement. So I'm going to quickly kind of suggest some areas where you might be able to dig into these channels. So on this channel of sort of training and experience during the military and whether the skills and attitudes developed during that service translate to the civil rights movement, I give you this kind of comparison right here. The 92nd Infantry Division, the 93rd Infantry Division. So these are sort of known to have very different levels of training, very different levels of success in the war. With the 93rd being a very successful unit, the 92nd not so successful, right? So if you have a way to distinguish between who served under these different kind of regimes, under different types of training, right? You could say, okay, are they more effective leaders in the civil rights movement or not? One thing that we have some results on in our work is the Tuskegee Airmen. They have a bigger effect in the counties where they're from than other GIs in terms of raising those voter registration rates. Very small sample sizes, very low power there. But I think you've got some possibilities exploring those avenues. On this, were the white GIs a help or hindrance? This is out of marital obligation. I include this because my wife's great-grandfather was in the Battle of Athens. So these are white GIs that came back to McMinn County, Tennessee, being run by sort of a corrupt political machine. They decided to run an all-GI ballot to sort of overturn that regime. It didn't work so well. It led to a violent battle over the ballot box. But there's this political motivation organization on the white GI's behalf as well, right? So potentially that helps and complements the civil rights movement. Now, this is where I'm sort of breaking the marital obligation here. A different way of telling the story, though, is that this is going to have nothing to do with the civil rights movement, right? This increased political activity. So this is one of the participants in that Battle of Athens explaining why it came to this, right? And it just says, we were used to drinking our liquor and beer without being molested. When these things happened, the GIs got madder. The more GIs they arrested, the more they beat up, the madder we got. And that's what spurred this political movement in McMinn County. Now, that's probably not going to then spill over into the civil rights movement if you read that motivation. Okay, so I think you've got a lot of potential there in the results of white GI rates of service versus black GI to sort of tease out some of these effects. I think there's some interesting things to think about that I don't have time to talk about the bias in the OLS estimates, maybe telling you something about sort of the volunteer service in the military or conscious objectors that might have some very interesting differences across race and be relevant to your story. And the local white backlash, which is something that I think you're starting to see in your results, this creates some big problems and big opportunities in terms of the timing of everything, right? So take your Strom Thurmond votes. This is right after returning from war, right? Then think about that 1954 to 63 protests, right? Well, now you've had time for white backlash to evolve, right? And so this matters for how you interpret coefficients, right? Because the effects of black GI are running counter to whatever this white backlash is, right? But it also matters for kind of what mechanisms underlie each different result, depending on the timing. So another kind of pie in the sky timing thing here, right? So this is just the share of males serving in different conflicts by birth year. So the blue lines there, solid line, are white males serving in World War II by birth cohort, dashed blue line, black males serving in World War II, right? So you have this majority of males serving in the military. You shift over to the Korean War, right? And still a huge number of males in the relevant birth cohorts serving in the military, but it's starting to no longer be the majority, right? And it's dropping faster, right? You drop below majority for black GIs faster than white guys, right? And so if you think about Korea, and then if you think about Vietnam further down the road, right? This is going to be a war heavily tied up with civil rights movements, right? But the nature of service is changing over time, right? So maybe exploiting differences in results across different conflicts helps you get at these different mechanisms in there. So one last thing on both timing and geography of this, right? One thing about these vets is they're not staying put. They're not staying where they enlisted, right? So this is in 1960, looking at World War II veterans and how many have moved across states. So it's a huge percentage. Those darker lines for both white vets and black vets, right? But you also have this different pattern by race, that service made you more likely to move as a black veteran. And so I think this is actually something that, while at first glance it's kind of going to complicate things for your instrument, it gives you a huge opportunity, right? Because you can use the 1940 census and the county people lived in 1935 for the sample line individuals that moved in the past 5 years. And you can do something like what Alora does in her Mobility and the Great Migration paper and say, let's look at northern cities. What counties were people coming from? Use the enlistment rates from those counties to think about the black GI presence in those northern cities, right, for political activity. So this is just where people living in Chicago came from among veterans, right? This is Richmond, because that'd be something local for me. But this is also going to give you another way to tease out black-white differences and sort of identify some mechanisms. Because the patterns for where white beds and black beds settled were very different, right? Or where they came from was very different. So I think you might be able to take some advantage of that. Right? There you go, Scott. So all of that.
So they can see the speaker. Now, where do you want me to stand to ask my question? Here or there?
Here's fine.
Here's fine. Okay, here's my question. Would you talk to us about what the historical evidence is showing? And not the econometric evidence, but the historical evidence, primary source materials that you're consulting that support the story that you're telling.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a different combination of things we're looking at, one of which is the anecdotal evidence, for example, from the different civil rights leaders who were veterans and their experience after the war. Then we also consulted the political science and sociology literature, for example, Del Fiume, 1968, or the book by Parker, 2009, who supports that narrative, but more in a descriptive way. And then, of course, also the historical literature. This most recent paper by Guillermo in 2018 on the topic that we dug out, where he essentially makes a claim that the Black veterans were an important driver and as organizers of this movement. And so we hope that this combination of sources and drawing from different literatures is going to help support that narrative that we're then trying to push with the econometrics.
But you're not looking at like the southern, like SNCC's archive or anything like that.
Also, we have information from the NAACP.
Here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the data from the NAACP archives and the CORE data. But what was that one called? All right. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, everyone, we're in business now. So up next, we're going to go with this. There was a change in the order of the paper given our audio difficulties. All solved. We're going with the second paper now to try to keep with the rest of the conference. And so up next is a paper titled The Cost of Employment, Segregation, Evidence from the Federal Government under Woodrow Wilson. And Abhay Aneja from UC Berkeley will present this here from Zoom.
Terrific. I'm going to try and share my screen, and just let me know if it comes up. And is it scrolling through okay? Terrific. All right. Well, thanks so much for inviting our paper to be on this terrific panel, and thanks to Marianne and the conference committee for letting me sub in for Guo at the last minute. Unfortunately, his child came down with COVID a few days ago, and so I'm here subbing in for him today. But I'm thrilled to be here and to hear everyone's questions and meet people as best we can under the circumstances. Great. So the big picture motivation for this project is that we're trying to understand the roots of persistent economic disparities along racial and ethnic lines in the U.S. I don't think I need to motivate this too much. Lots of people on this panel in this room have contributed a ton to the literature that's helped us in this project. And yeah, I don't think I need to motivate this too much except to say that racial disparities in income, wealth, and health status and other outcomes are common in lots of settings, including the U.S. And there's a conventional wisdom, and at least in some places, perhaps we can think about outcome gaps as being in part the historical legacy of subjugation that we might think about as being sanctioned by the state. And we think it's important to identify the contributions of these sorts of institutional forces to racial, economic, and social gaps, since one of the major rationales for a variety of different remedial policies in democratic settings, like affirmative action in the US or quotas in other countries, are sort of, the contribution of government to contemporary gaps. Now, quantitatively thinking about the short-term and persistent effects of discrimination in the distant past is pretty difficult for at least two reasons. First, as you go a bit further in time, it's harder and harder to get good data to measure discrimination. And then the second challenge is that it's often hard to sort of link outcome gaps to very specific episodes of discrimination. So what we're trying to do in this project is make some progress on this front by studying an episode of government-sponsored discrimination, which was the segregation of the federal civil service under President Woodrow Wilson, beginning in 1912 and 1913. And so this project is going to try and move the ball on these questions by showing three main things in the paper. I'll sort of focus on one and three here. First, we're going to show that segregation of the civil service had a substantial negative effect on the earnings of Black American civil servants. Second, we think that these effects are mainly being driven by demotions of otherwise qualified Black Americans to other jobs within the government. And then finally, we showed that this effect had effects that rippled across the life cycle and even across generations. We see the effects of segregation within the government actually also affecting the downstream effects on the children of those parents who were affected by the Wilson regime. Okay, so just a little bit on the context for our study. So before Wilson assumed office, the federal government actually was one of the provided one of the opportunities for relative, at least, economic mobility for Black Americans. Unfortunately, this changed when Wilson was elected president in 1912. One of his first domestic acts was to separate the federal workforce by race, and the way he did this, at least our interpretation or our read of the history, is that he did this by essentially ordering his cabinet appointees to sort of carry out this sort of executive policy. And so what do I mean by a policy of workplace segregation in this context? Well, of course, in a literal sense, people may think, well, okay, segregation sort of means separate but equal. It may mean sort of people doing the same job, but members of one race in one part of a building and members of another race in another part of a building doing sort of the same types of work. The historical evidence suggests otherwise. Segregation was really carried out as a program of sort of demotions of qualified black workers to worse paying jobs and even dismissals. And so, I think we're thinking about segregation here as being sort of analogous to a general regime of discrimination carried out against Black American civil servants. And so what we're essentially going to test for in this paper is sort of the existence of this ceiling government-wide and the cost to Black workers and their families. Great. So a bit on the background of the data. So the main source of data for our project is about a little more than 15 years worth of information from a government source called the United States Official Register, which is essentially a complete roster of every federal government employee working nationwide and what that person did. So this was a volume that started being issued biennially in the 1820s. It ended in the 1950s. And so we digitized sort of a subset of these records that were relevant for trying to understand the effect of segregation on Black Americans. And so I'll just give you an example, zoom in a bit, sort of give you a sense of what we digitized. So this is sort of a snippet of one page of an official register. And I've sort of highlighted in the red box sort of the data for one particular person. And so for John Davis, what we see here is that we can observe, of course, the John Davis's name. We can see the department that he worked in, his job title, or what we might think about as his occupation, his salary, a little bit of information on where he's from, and then where he worked. So we see that he worked in DC. And so essentially what we did here was sort of a combination of OCR and manual checking. It took a chunk of time, but I think it allows us to sort of track over time a good subset, and we think sort of the universe of civil servants in the U.S. in the 19 teens and early 20s. Great. So let's dive into the analysis quickly. So one challenge for us in terms of being able to really assess how segregation affected Black civil servants relative to white civil servants is sort of thinking about the right counterfactual for sort of understanding the effect of this policy of discrimination. So what we're going to do essentially is use a combination of matching and differences. So to sort of find a good counterfactual group of white civil servants, essentially what we're going to do is sort of use the richness of the data we have to match each Black civil servant to a sort of comparable white civil servant on what we observe in the data, namely, the department and bureau that person worked in, his or her sex, the type of contract that person was working under, whether it was sort of an annual salary or whether it was sort of more of a monthly or weekly contract, the age of that person, and then we'll even sort of match on salary, which we might think about as sort of being a composite of sort of skill and experience. So just to sort of make it a little bit clearer, what we're doing here. I'm just going to step back and give you kind of an example using the story of one Black civil servant in particular. So it turns out that a few years ago, when sort of the legacy, the more complicated legacy of Woodrow Wilson was sort of first coming to light in public consciousness, the grandson of a Black civil servant during the early 1900s actually wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about the destructive legacy of Wilson's segregation regime, both on his grandfather and his grandfather's family. And so that person was a gentleman named John Abraham Davis. He's here on the left-hand side. And at the time, actually, he sort of held a managerial position in the government printing office. And these were actually sort of the people that sort of worked under him in the GPO. And so what we do essentially is sort of leverage the data we have to find John Davis's counterpart in our data. And what we see here is that we can find someone who looks pretty close on observable dimensions. So that person was someone named Willard Pollard. We see that he's born just 2 years later, works in the same place, born in the same place, and even earns the same salary as Davis in 1911 before Wilson comes into office. And what's sort of striking is that as soon as Wilson comes into office, we sort of see their occupational and earnings trajectories sort of diverge. We see that they're earning the same amount in the years leading up to 1912, and then beginning in 1913, we see John Davis sort of demoted to a skilled laborer position elsewhere in the government. And by the time Wilson leaves office, Davis is actually earning just a third of what we might think about as his sort of direct counterpart was earning in the civil service. And so what we're going to do here is essentially sort of, use our matched sample of civil service and sort of estimate sort of a straightforward difference in difference regression, where we're sort of comparing the earnings of Black civil servants relative to white civil servants before and after Wilson comes into office. And so, in a nutshell, this is sort of our main result in graphical form. And so, kind of what we see here is that the civil service was a place of sort of relative equality in the years leading up to Wilson's election, although, a part of this is mechanical because we're matching in 1911. And then, things just get sort of dramatically worse for Black Americans in the years of Wilson's term in office. And so, this table sort of summarizes that main result from the previous slide in sort of regression form. And what we see is that by 1921, Black Americans have sort of suffered about an 8% percentage point earnings hit relative to white civil servants. We see that result is quite robust to sort of individual fixed effects. We also see sort of some amount of, what we might think about as occupational downgrading. Black Americans are about 2% percentage points less likely to be employed full time as well. We do a number of robustness checks that I'm happy to talk about offline or in the Q&A. But I'll spend my last few slides just talking a bit about the long-term effects. So We also wanted to sort of examine how this episode of discrimination sort of played out in the long run. And so we looked at how segregation affected what we might think about as a proxy for the racial wealth gap by sort of linking our civil service sample to the complete count censuses, which of course have data on home ownership, and also use the same data to sort of look at how what the effects were on the kids of those who were affected by segregation. So looking at how segregation affect the racial home ownership gap. Of course, one downside here is that we're sort of losing the high frequency nature of the data, but sort of using the same design, what we see here is that after Wilson comes into office, the relative rates of Black home ownership declined pretty rapidly after 1910. So that's sort of what the sort of the black line on the slide is sort of the civil servant sample. And then to sort of, reassure us that this really is sort of, a segregation effect or sort of civil service effect, rather sort of a general sort of economy-wide effect. We sort of benchmark these effects against sort of a comparable set of workers in the private sector. And so this sort of reassures us again that we think we're sort of really picking up something that's specific to the effects of Woodrow Wilson's policies. And then finally, to wrap things up and get a full picture of, or a more complete picture, if you will, of the cost of discrimination, we sort of look at sort of the intergenerational effects. And the way we do this is by sort of using, of course, we can't sort of do a difference in difference or sort of pre-post type analysis anymore, because we just observed the earnings of kids in adulthood in 1940. We're going to sort of use we're going to sort of compare the young versus old kids within the household at the time of Wilson's order, because there's going to be some kids, of course, who would have aged out of the household at the time that Wilson was inaugurated, and then again use as the private sector gap as sort of a third difference. And what we see again is that within the civil service, that the kids who were affected by Wilson's policy relative to those who weren't, and again, comparing Black versus white, we see that those kids achieve about 3 fewer years of school as measured in 1940. And again, the fact that this result sort of holds up when we sort of again use this sort of third difference of the private sector, again sort of gives us some reassurance that this really is sort of an effect that we think about as being specific to the effects of Woodrow Wilson's policies. And so I'll sort of stop there. I think hopefully I haven't run over. Again, this is our goal here was to try and sort of get some traction on what the effects of state-sponsored discrimination was, and so we think that this provides some evidence that the government is perhaps responsible for some of the effects that persisted even into the next generation. And I'll stop there, and thanks in advance for Dan for giving us actually a second round of comments. Actually, he was able to see this actually a year ago when we were first sort of starting to present it, and so grateful in advance for the chance to hear from him.
Okay, thanks. Should I just go on, Marianne, or?
Yes, Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, go to presentation mode, Dan.
Oh, how do I do that?
Go to slideshow.
No. Here we go. I get embarrassed in public and my complete lack of. Can I just? Oh, wait. Can you see it?
We can see it. But go to the 7th thing where it says slideshow at the top.
Does it matter, or can I just do it this way?
You do it this way. You're
All right.
Go for
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so
one thing, Dan. I just want to let you know we're going to go a few minutes over time given our audio difficulties. Thank you.
Okay. So let me just start by saying this is a fantastic paper. It's really kind of challenging to try to discuss a paper that essentially does everything you could really think of, and it's being published in a top journal, which is completely deserving. So to some degree, I could just stop there, but that's not really what we do, is it? So I'll just keep going. So why do I like this paper so much? So it's probably Captain Obvious stuff to point out that it's really rare to identify such a blatant change in discrimination policy with such a really clean timestamp. Like, the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson starts this new policy. So it's really well identified. We know who the treated people are here. We can, they did a great job coming up with a very convincing control group. And not only that, Abhay didn't have time to talk about this, but there's really neat institutional cross-sectional sources of variation to take advantage of here too. And they do some of that in the paper that I'll talk about a little. And then they're bringing this really important new data. It's basically administrative personnel records for the government, which I think is really great. And I'm doing a little of this myself. I think it's just the idea of using personnel records to try to fill in a lot of holes that we have about the early 20th century labor markets is really underexploited and super important. So let me start off by saying things that I'm totally convinced on after reading the paper. Clearly, the relative income of Black civil servants fell. That's just a slam dunk. That example with John Davis is really neat, really, really neat. But it's clearly a broader problem. The time pattern is sort of intriguing. For their research design, it's really nice that they see an immediate decline in the first year of the administration. The effects look like they kind of stabilize after that, like between 1915 and 1919. At least statistically, you can't tell the difference. And then there's another tumble between 1919 and 1921. I'm not sure if I should make a big deal about this or not. It may just be noisy estimates, but that secular pattern seems kind of intriguing and be kind of nice to know something about changes in the way the policy was handled over time and whether you actually see that in the data. So that's number one. So number two is, why did income decline? So you mentioned that there was a lot of demotions, that was the main reason. But there's also an increase in entry into low wage occupations and an exit from high wage occupations. The exit results are kind of interesting because they mostly pile into one particular decile, the 8th decile. And I was just kind of curious, what titles are actually in that decile? I have a hunch that's where a lot of the supervisors like John Davis actually were, and managers. Because if that's the case, that could really explain why there was so much persistence in these results, even well after the Wilson regime. If you lose a whole generation of supervisors in the federal government, that's just going to wipe out an awful lot of opportunities going forward. So that's the second thing. The third thing is this really interesting cross-sectional differences by agency that line up pretty well with the views of the cabinet leaders. I think this is really important, and they document this, but they don't necessarily take advantage of it as much as maybe I would have. So basically what happened was a bunch of agencies wind up demoting and causing big damage to Black civil servants. But then there are a couple that actually go the opposite direction, in particular, labor and commerce. So there's an interesting question of are people actually switching across agencies to take advantage of the differences in the cabinet leaders' positions on segregation? I think that's something you could actually do pretty easily given your data. And one thing that I'd be really intrigued about is if you actually didn't see that kind of moving going on, because that might suggest there was some collusion across the agencies, which would be another source of why there would be so much persistence in these effects, even beyond the Wilson administration. I feel like it's my duty to point out as a Federal Reserve employee that the Fed actually was born in 1913, the first year of the Wilson administration. I know you don't have a pre-period, so you probably don't include them, but I assume the board employees are actually in the registries. And if they are, that actually might be kind of interesting because they're like a blank slate. And so you might want to see if, in fact, there was anything about the hiring processes going on in this new administration. To me, that sounds like a really neat experiment. And you could kind of compare it vis-a-vis to Treasury, which is doing a lot of the same stuff. And they had a segregationist leader at the time. And then the last thing that they talked about with regard to the civil servants that were actually impacted was this effect on home ownership, which is also really neat and long lasting. Okay, so I want to say that the effects that they're finding are really big. Pretty much across the board, especially once you get beyond income. So I already talked about like the persistence of the labor market implications of all this, and they show that with the census data. The housing, the home ownership effects are I mean, I can't even get my handle around how big they are. Basically, they're saying they're finding a 3.5% hit on biannual earnings is leading to a 14% decline in home ownership. I asked one of my colleagues who's kind of a personal finance person, what would be an elasticity that I should be thinking about for this particular parameter? I told him the results, and he said, "Oh my God, that's obviously like way out of proportion to what you'd see today." And it sort of makes sense given the way. Thanks, Simone. 5 minutes. How discriminatory the housing market was during the 20s and 30s and beyond. And then the intergenerational effects are also really, really strikingly large. There's obviously a huge literature in economics and sociology that have been trying to estimate intergenerational effects for years and years and years. What's really neat about their estimates, and this is probably my favorite part of the paper, is it's really hard and rare to find incidences where you can isolate an exogenous shock to the parent's circumstances and trace it to the kids. Probably labor economists often think about like Oriopolis, Page and Stevens paper as an example of this kind of thing where they study job displacement in Canada and then trace it out to the kids. The effects that they find are roughly in the order of about a little under 10% on kids' earnings. These guys are finding something like 25%. Okay, so and almost 2.5 years on education. These are just numbers that you just wouldn't ever see in post World War II. So this thing had like a gigantic effect on this particular generation, and this is including kids up to the age of 18, which kind of, I would have thought like kids that were in 16, 17, 18 probably wouldn't be impacted that much by their dads. They're all lumped in here. So that just gives you, an even better idea of how big these actual effects are. So why are they so big is, I think, a really important question. One kind of throwaway thing that I could say, and I will say, is there are probably a lot of different channels in which this is happening. For example, there's a lot of evidence nowadays that that growing up in tough circumstances affects, for example, your health, in particular your mental health. I know these are things you wouldn't be able to measure in old data, but can potentially rationalize big effects. But in this specific episode, I think I would have maybe thinking about intergenerational effects on industry choice, for example. So there's a large literature in sociology on the transmission of occupation and occupational prestige. None of that is causal. So, here you're doing something way beyond what they can do. But these things tend to be really big. In fact, they're often measured as big as income intergenerational transmission as well. And then there's also papers on intergenerational transmission of specific employers, where here I'm thinking of the specific employer as the federal government. And so there's a few recent papers about this. Martha Stinson has one on the US using census data, and Miles Korak on using Canadian data. What I'm trying to point out is that this is a channel that might have gotten shut down, even among the older kids, and that could have led to really big effects. And I think these are all, got it 1 minute, important things that you can actually measure in your data. Okay, so I got 1 more minute, so let me just make one more point, which is the population that's being studied here is really tiny. Okay, so Industry 50 in 1910, which is Industry 50 Code 916, which is federal government, is about 1/10 of a percentage point of the 16 to 54 workforce in 1910. So, a bigger question is like, did this have a wider impact than just on the civil servants that were treated? So, it's two ways that I would think about attacking this. And, if you guys were interested in writing another paper, somebody else was, this is kind of what I would personally focus on. One is look at local labor markets that had large federal government imprints. So obviously that's DC, but there's also some other cities that have a lot of federal government employees. San Francisco, Columbus, Ohio, Seattle, doesn't have a huge federal government workforce, but a lot of Black Americans that were living in Seattle were working for the federal government there. And so I'd like to know, like, did this actually affect the occupational structure of the local labor market, given, that this potentially had a big impact on the federal government in these areas. And then the second thing, and then I'll stop, is postal workers. Postal workers were actually 4 times bigger than the federal government civil service. Albert Burleson was a well-known segregationist. There's terrible stories about what he did. He was like, within 2 months of being inaugurated, he was pushing for segregation all over the country. This must have had a big impact. And the NAACP knew this, actually. They spent a lot of resources in the teens and especially in the 20s, specifically going after the post office, employment discrimination lawsuits in the post office. So it's well known that this was going on. So, it's something I would really think about using census data to try to look at. So, but it was lovely paper.
Thanks, Dan. That was awesome.
We have 2 questions already from the chat, and the first question comes from Mohammed Saleh. And Mohammed, are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
Okay, can you ask your question?
Yeah, so I was just wondering about, if you can say something about the extensive margin of discrimination, like discrimination in terms of employment by the federal government itself, and not only discriminatory policies conditional on being employed as a civil servant. I know that that's already like a bigger question, and it may be beyond the paper, but thank you.
Terrific question. Yeah, I think Dan touched a bit on this on his discussion. I didn't have a chance. Sorry to talk about this in the talk, but we do spend some time talking about it in the paper, that we think that another channel, although perhaps not the dominant channel, is the extensive margin. We do see, again, that Black Americans are more likely to leave the federal government, particularly at the higher end, at higher end occupations. That could be, again, because rather than sort of accepting a demotion to a lower paid position, they were opting to leave the federal civil service. Hard to know for sure, and I think this relates, to maybe Edson's question, which I'll sort of circle back to, about where are they going. And then we don't see a reduction in overall entry, but we do see sort of a reduction in the entry into it. We see more entrance into worse paying jobs within the civil service, and so we think that's perhaps sort of another part of the channel, although again, likely not the dominant channel, given that we see so much of the effect being driven by demotions.
Okay, thank you, Abhay. We've got to keep things brief now because we still have one more paper. Anybody from the audience? Otherwise, I'm turning just very briefly to Edson. Can you ask your question briefly? And Abhay, can you answer it briefly?
Yeah, this is great. He already touched on my question, which is, are they quitting at a higher rate, and where are they going? And if they're earning as much as they would have in the federal government without the policy?
Yeah, so I mean, I think part of that was picked up in Mohammed's question, but one thing we don't do, and perhaps would like to push on, is where are they going? We have not done much work on sort of those who leave. What sorts of jobs are they going to? Within the private sector. It's something that for us to think about for sure, and that we don't do much of here.
Okay, fantastic. We got to turn to our last paper, which is actually our first paper, and Mark Anderson is going to present that. So, Mark, are you ready to go?
I am ready to go.
Can you share your stuff?
Yes.
I'll close the chat.
How's that look? We good?
Yeah, unless
Okay.
you want to make it full screen.
Oh, yes, I will. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for having me. Wishing I was there in person, but having a 2-year-old who may bust into my office at any given moment has thwarted travel much more so than COVID has for me. So we'll do this virtually. So we are looking at the civil rights era hospital desegregation movement and the black-white infant mortality gap. This is joint with Kerwin, Charles, and Dan Rees. Most of you are probably very well aware of the fact that during the Jim Crow era, Southern hospitals were racially segregated. Black hospitals that existed at the time were, with maybe a few exceptions, were very much understaffed, lacked the latest medical technologies. White-run hospitals could be biracial, but Black patients in these hospitals were physically separated from their white counterparts and certainly did not receive equal care. And eradicating this entrenched system of discrimination was a key objective of the civil rights movement. And under political and some legal pressures, we saw in the early 60s a handful of hospitals in the South desegregate. But the landscape changed pretty drastically in 1965, on July 30th, 1965, when President Johnson signed Medicare into law, promising to generously pay for the health care of millions. So what happened? Well, most Southern hospitals were indeed segregated all the way through to the spring of 66, when the federal government threatened to then withhold Medicare funding from those that were not in compliance with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. So what did Title VI of the Civil Rights Act say? Well, in short, it said that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. By the fall of 66, by November of 66, more than 7,000 hospitals had been certified by this newly created Office of Equal Health Opportunity as eligible to receive Medicare funds. What did this OEHO do? A lot of things. I'll just highlight a few of its roles. It disseminated a set of guidelines to which participating hospitals were supposed to adhere. The litmus test was race-blind assignment of patients to beds and doctors to patients. And they also trained hundreds of investigators to conduct on-site inspections of hospitals. And at least initially, these were some very serious efforts on the part of the OEHO. So over 200 Southern hospitals, however, opted to forgo all federal funding. Several of these, which we call non-compliant hospitals in the paper, they actually resisted integrating their facilities all the way through the early 1970s. And this campaign to desegregate hospitals, it's been described as a powerful force for equal treatment, and it's been listed as among the most important civil rights achievements in U.S. history. Surprisingly, it's been very much understudied. Unlike school desegregation efforts, which has been studied a lot, hospital desegregation, not so much. There is one prominent exception, and this is a paper that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. So Almond Chain Greenstone used data from Mississippi and found that the Black post-neonatal mortality rate, I'll mention why they focus on the post-neonatal period here in a few minutes, but they found that the Black post-neonatal mortality rate fell much faster in counties that were served by a Medicare-eligible hospital than in counties that were not. And they concluded that this federal campaign to desegregate saved thousands of lives and contributed substantially to the narrowing of the national Black-white post-neonatal mortality gap during the period 65 to 75. And their effect sizes were really large. And they were so large that they were enough to explain the entire convergence between Black and white infant mortality rates in Mississippi during this post-1965 period. So one thing they were not able to do, because of their limited variation in their treatment indicators, they weren't able to account for the strong secular downward trend in the Black post-neonatal mortality rate during this period of interest. So it was modest variation in their Medicare certification dates that precluded them from controlling for year fixed effects in their regressions. So what do? Well, we try to build on this Allman et al. Paper. We use county level data from the multiple cause of death files published by the Vital Stats, and we re-examine this relationship between the desegregation campaign and the Black-white infant mortality gap. So initially, we wanted to focus on the entire, all of the states in the South. We ended up just focusing on the 5 deep South states, mostly because data transcription efforts were fairly onerous. So we focus on Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. So these are the 5 states where support for segregationist policies and practices was particularly staunch. One of the advantages of using data from these 5 states in the Deep South, as opposed to just Mississippi, is that we observe more than double the Medicare county level variation than did previous authors. And it certainly allows us to distinguish the effects of access from the secular Black infant mortality rate trend. So during the 60s, the Black infant mortality rate was indeed trending downward across the Deep South and the rest of the country. But the figure I'm going to show you here is based on data from the 5 states in our sample. So we have the Black infant mortality rate, the white infant mortality rate going from, so our analysis goes from 59 to 73. And we do see this narrowing of the gap, but we also see these smooth trends running through 1966. So what do we find? So again, leveraging significantly more cross-county variation in Medicare certification dates than were available to previous authors and flexibly controlling for common shocks, we're able to estimate the contribution of the desegregation campaign to the general downward trend in Black infant mortality. And our results suggest that having access to a Medicare-eligible hospital had little, if any, effect on Black infant mortality. And these results, maybe in hindsight, aren't super surprising. I mean, they were surprising initially because we always had the Allman et al. paper in the back of our minds. But maybe in hindsight, the results shouldn't have been that surprising. And they're consistent with descriptions of the federal campaign as producing strikingly limited and largely cosmetic changes. And we think, we potentially contribute to this more general point of illustrating the limits of anti-discrimination policies imposed upon very reluctant actors. So what do we find? Well, we find that having access to a certified hospital is associated with 1.36 additional Black infant deaths per 1,000 live Black births. This is a small number. This is insignificant, but it's a precise 0. And it's precise enough to reject the hypothesis that the campaign contributed substantially to the narrowing of the Black-white infant mortality gap during this period of interest. So our bottom line, what's our bottom line before I actually get to some of the results? These OEHO investigators were not tasked with addressing structural barriers that exist today and prevent minority patients from accessing high-quality healthcare. And they certainly couldn't expunge the deeply held racial prejudices that had been fostered for generations. In 1972, the Government Accounting Office, the GAO, released an assessment of compliance, hospital-level compliance with Title VI, and it concluded that the campaign had essentially eliminated what they referred to as overt discrimination, but more what they referred to as subtle forms of discrimination persisted. I'll let you all judge if some of these anecdotes are consistent with a subtle form of discrimination. We have a laundry list of anecdotes that made the paper and many more that didn't, but I just picked out a couple to share with you for this short talk. So this is a quote from Jeffrey Merrill, who was the coordinator of the Action Board of the American Public Health Association. And this is evidence of ostensibly desegregated hospitals defying the Title VI guidelines. So last year, the APHA was involved in a study in Mississippi where we had the opportunity to examine a lot of hospitals within the Delta area. There were 2 things we found out through this study. One is that on a given day when the hospital is forewarned of a visit by some sort of enforcement agency, beds are shifted, and it's very simple to shift a bed on wheels. And so coincidentally, on that, and maybe for a couple of days, the hospital appears totally integrated. And our results suggest that correcting these overtly discriminatory practices was just simply not enough. So I have one other anecdote here to share with you. This comes from Neshoba County newspaper clipping. So Neshoba County is in Mississippi. And this describes a policy that the hospital manager at the time, and you guys will see that this is timestamped 1971 up here. So well after 1966. This details a hospital level policy the manager was trying to get passed. It did not pass, but it provides some evidence of some of the efforts that were being made. So I've just highlighted the 2 paragraphs with the pertinent information. A new policy requiring all Black Medicare patients to pay a $250 deposit before being allowed to enter the hospital did not pass. That's a non-trivial sum by today's standards. The plan would not require whites to make deposits, he said, since most could afford to pay the balance of their hospital debts. And then I have one last picture to show you. While Tennessee did not make the sample, this is an overcrowded maternity ward in Memphis. The photo was taken in 1970, well after the hospital was desegregated. So back to our principal question of interest, did this campaign contribute to the narrowing of the gap? Campaign that started in 1966. Certainly there were other things going on at the time that could have mattered. Black Southerners were making significant progress, both in absolute and relative terms, and there were other policies going on. Rollout of community health centers, Bailey and Goodman-Bacon have showed that this potentially mattered. Implementation of state Medicaid programs, which we tried to take into account a little bit, which I probably won't have time to talk about. So how are we going to try to isolate the effect of desegregation of hospitals? Well, we're going to take this event study approach. So we're estimating everyone here, I'm guessing, is very familiar with an event study. We've already seen these in some of the previous talks, so I won't belabor this, but we're going to look at the pre and post time periods following certification at the county level. Our dependent variable of interest is going to be various forms of the infant mortality rate in County C during year T for this period 1959 to 1973. And our information on Medicare certification comes from these guide issues that were published by the Journal of the American Hospital Association. This was a couple year long data transcription efforts. Originally, as I mentioned earlier, we wanted to look at all states in the South, but we ended up just focusing on 5 because it took a long time to transcribe data for those 5. So let's look at, we're going to follow Allman et al. For our first set of results. And we're going to exclude the year fixed effects. And what do we see when we do that? Well, we have this strong downward trend running through time of treatment. Now, if we were to summarize these pre and post-treatment indicators, we would get a standard difference in difference estimate that's large and negative 13.3 fewer Black infant deaths per 1,000 live Black births. And this is large relative to this pre-treatment mean. So if we simply just control for common shocks by adding year fixed effects in the model, we get this flat event study. We get a corresponding difference in difference estimates that's small, it's precise, even though it's statistically insignificant. And based on the 90% confidence interval of this estimate, gaining access to a desegregated hospital did not reduce the Black infant mortality rate by more than minus 0.47 or less than 3% of the actual change in the infant mortality rate between 65 and 73. And another reason we like this event study specification, while we tried to spot check as many of the certification dates as possible using contemporary sources, the AHA guide was incredibly accurate, but every time we found a discrepancy, we tried to go with those contemporary sources for the time when our indicator would turn on. But you might be worried that there's this lagged process of segregating a hospital, and again, that's why we like the event study approach as opposed to just the standard difference in difference estimate. Results change little when we control for a vector of county level observables. Results are similar when we consider the Black-white difference as the dependent variable as opposed to just the Black infant mortality rate. So I'll quickly go through our last set of results. We also are going to look at post-neonatal mortality and mortality due to preventable causes. Allman et al. Convincingly argue that this is where we should expect to find effects being stronger. The technologies benefiting the neonatal period were not available during the time. And deaths due to causes such as influenza, pneumonia, and diarrhea were largely preventable with timely hospital treatment. So we get, again, these precise zeros if we focus on the neonatal or the post-neonatal period. And we also get these precise flat event studies if we look at mortality due to pneumonia, influenza, or diarrhea among Black infants. So our general null result holds up. I do not want to, the paper's 90 pages long because in typical fashion, it's bloated with robustness checks. So I'm going to skip over, for the sake of time, a handful of the robustness checks that we thought about. Maybe people will ask some questions where I can talk about these a little bit, but for the sake of time, let me just wrap up. So what do we do? Well, we used county level data from 5 states, allowing us to exploit a lot more variation than almond at all. We find that after we control for this secular downward trend in Black infant mortality, that having access to a desegregated hospital had no observable effect on the Black infant mortality rate. And our estimates are precise. We have precise nulls. So where are we at now? Well, the Black-white infant mortality gap has been closing steadily in several southern states over the past 2 decades. And it's absolutely possible that this would not have occurred without the initial push to desegregate by the Johnson administration. So it's important to point out that these are short-run effects that we're estimating. Where should future research go? This is what we're trying to do next. We're trying to figure out factors that did contribute to the narrowing of this gap. And I think I'm 20 seconds over, so I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you so much, Mark. And up to discuss is Ed Severini. He's ready to go. Ed, do you have slides or you just want to talk?
All right. Thanks, Mark, for the clear presentation, and thanks everybody for being here, Zoom or in person. It was great, reading carefully this paper. It was a pleasure to read, and thanks to Mark for a great presentation. I'm going to just go quickly here. They are exploiting discount level variation in Medicare certification dates, which is indicator for desegregation, to analyze the impact of hospitals desegregation on the Black-white infant mortality gap. They are looking at the 5 South states in the period 59-73, and they reject no hypothesis that this federal hospital desegregation contributed meaningfully to the narrowing of the Black-white infant mortality in the deep South. They also find no effects on accelerating trends towards in-hospital births from Southern Black mothers. So they conclude that these are results consistent with descriptions of the campaign as being just producing only cosmetic changes, which is illustrating the limits of these anti-discrimination policies imposed upon reluctant actors. As I said, it's a very well-written paper, well-executed study, a pleasure to read. I have a few comments just to help maybe providing some direction on where the paper should go, in my opinion. But before that, I just have another picture here of just to make sure that you understand, like these are segregated wards in the hospital. This is in the University Hospital in University of Alabama in Birmingham. So it was prevalent at this time, as Mark said, potentially understudied. So the first comment I have is about the organization of the paper. I think the way it's written, even though I like the writing of the paper, it's almost as if it's a comment to almond et al. And I think it diminishes a little bit the contribution of the paper. I think the paper is a standalone contribution. They are expanding the sample. They're exploiting a number of other features. Also, I'm guessing one of what the referees might have said, like, there's a trend, that downward trend, and you're not controlling from the downward trend, like what is that we are actually capturing in the diff. So I would suggest like some reorganization in the paper just to make sure that like it's not seen as just an extension of Allen et al. So I would suggest expanding the paper in 2 dimensions. One is more longer run effects in some of the heterogeneity analysis. In terms of the long run outcomes, I would potentially include data up to the late 80s. So I think this data that they are using, especially for the mortality data, it might be available until 88 without actually requesting the identifiers for the counties. And the way I see it is there could potentially be a learning process happening. So Black mothers are giving birth in the hospitals, and there's a trend up in this case. And so maybe using the cumulative number of in-hospital births since the segregation to try to see whether they are updating their priors, that there would be this discriminatory practices in the hospital. Also, maybe, for example, after the disclosure of the Tuskegee experiment, there might be some sort of, variation in whether the update goes downhill or not. Marian and Marcella had this amazing paper, and they show, that infant mortality is going downwards, for both Black kids, at the time in child mortality, but there might be some differences here based on the intervention. And just to take like some variation from their paper, like here is two potential sources of variation of how close you are to the episode, like maybe distance to Tuskegee or the fraction of Black migrants from Alabama. So you would have, a way to interact with the effects to see if something is happening there in terms of this update. Also, as Mark mentioned, there was this GAO report concluding that hospital desegregation had virtually eliminated the overt racial discrimination, while more subtle forms of racial discrimination persisted. So I wonder if there would be a ways to see whether local attitudes towards African Americans, or even the presence of local Black activists would potentially be changing the results. Maybe it was the average is zero effects, but maybe depending on the local attitudes, this might have reinforced, a pattern that they should be less discriminatory towards African Americans. So again, there is variation coming from politics here. So the Ileana Kuzienko and Bonia Washington paper showing like the shift on the southern states going towards or leaving the Democratic Party before the election of LBJ. So like you could use the shares of the share of votes for LBJ as a proxy for how the attitudes are changing prior to the desegregation of the hospitals. And then of course Tiani one paper looking at how like the diffusion of Black radio and Black voter registration, like this could be another source of differences towards where these attitudes might be changing faster. And then the last part would be what Mark was saying at the end. There's potentially a variety of other changes happening and could contribute to this, the narrowing of the gap. Probably not, based on their data in the analysis from the hospital desegregation per se on average, but it could be interacting with other programs. For example, there's the Hilberton program, and we have data showing, how this actually increased the access to hospitals and hospital beds, in this the period of analysis for them. They did, include these interactions with Medicaid implementation, and they showed that doesn't affect very much. But maybe, there are other factors that might be contributing in terms of fertility trends, like the introduction and diffusion of the PO. You have the family planning programs that are also disseminating as part of the war on poverty. Again, it's affecting somehow the denominator here, the number of infant lives or the number of live births. So I think it could be potentially contributing as well, or maybe interacting with the effect of the hospital desegregation. Also, maybe like some, bring a little bit from my own research about pollution. Maybe there's something about pollution as well. Like there's, some, early data on where they had pollution monitors, for example, since 1957. That was a clear indication that the county was very polluted. Maybe decreases in pollution might have contributed as well. And having the opportunity to go to the hospital might have contributed to, a reduction in mortality, because now they have access to hospitals in case they are suffering the consequence of pollution exposure, for example. So I think there might be some further analysis that could potentially contribute to the where the paper is going. But again, fantastic paper. I really recommend everybody to read it. And it's, as always, a pleasure to discuss Mark's work.
Thank you so much, Edson. It's a fascinating panel. I see these folks in the audience, and I need a question from the audience. Otherwise, you don't get your coffee. So I need somebody here to ask a question. And I'm going to ask the online folks, is there a question there? Okay. We do have someone from the audience. Okay, you can also speak there, but
just want to make a comment to amplify what Ed said. This paper is an odd position. It is refuting an unpublished working paper from 15 years ago. And that does make it odd, and yet I think it is the right thing to do, because at least among civil rights scholars, that paper got quite a bit of attention. And in particular, there's a dramatic graph showing the decline in postnatal Black infant mortality relative to white, coming almost immediately with the desegregation. When I was completing Time on the Cross, I tried to get permission to include that graph, because it always gets a big reaction from the audience. but the journal, AER, wouldn't do it because the paper was not published. I'm now glad that I didn't get permission because it's been refuted, so I don't have to issue a correction. There were aspects of the civil rights revolution that did have almost immediate, instantaneous results. Publication, public accommodations was one. Integration of the textiles industry was another. So I think the key point that these were reluctant compliers. In those other cases, they were maybe initially reluctant, but they learned not to be. So I think exploring variation in the degree and basis of that reluctance is one of the promising areas that you should pursue. Yep.
Thank you, Gavin.
Hey, thank you. I couldn't see your face, but I think that was Dr. Wright, yeah?
Yeah, that was Gavin.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Do I have a second to say anything at all?
Yeah, quickly. They want the coffee, quickly.
Okay. Edson, I appreciate the comments. I think both Edson and Gavin touched on two things that are really, or one thing that's really important that we can do, and that's some further heterogeneity analyses. I completely agree. I think some of these things are absolutely items that we'll include in the paper. And we've struggled with like how much of this is a comment, how much of it is standalone. We've written the paper half a dozen times one way as opposed to the other. And so, this helps us, I think, push us further in the direction, maybe away from a comment-esque type of paper. But that's been like one of the biggest struggles. So anyway, I appreciate the very helpful comments. So thank you.
Is there anybody else? Marianne, you want to say something? No? Okay. So, Marianne, please, quickly.
Just thank you. It worked well. Thanks to everybody.
Well, your work was mentioned.
Simone. That was
your work
the
was
hero.
mentioned this last paper. Don't you want to say something? So we can talk about it.
I tell you what, we'll let you guys go. We might stay on Zoom, but you guys can log off.
Okay, thank you, everybody.